Living with your enemy gives you access to their entire life. I learned this lesson the hard way when I discovered that my roommate Jake had been sleeping with my girlfriend behind my back. But here's the thing about betrayal. It teaches you patience, and patience is the most dangerous weapon you can possess. My name is Marcus, and this is the story of how I destroyed someone's future so completely that they never even knew I was the one holding the knife. It started on a Tuesday evening in October. I came home early from work, expecting to find my apartment empty as usual. Jake was supposed to be at his part-time job at the campus bookstore, and Sarah, my girlfriend of 2 years, had told me she was studying at the library. But as I climbed the stairs to our second-floor apartment, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Sarah's laugh, coming from Jake's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I saw them together. Not just talking, not just hanging out, together in the way that only lovers are. Sarah was wearing the necklace I'd given her for our anniversary, and Jake had his hands tangled in her hair the same way I used to. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds watching my entire relationship crumble in real time. Then I quietly backed away, went to a coffee shop, and came home 2 hours later, acting like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. Everything had changed. See, most people would have confronted them immediately, screaming, accusations, dramatic exits, the whole 9 yards. But I'm not most people, and I understood something that hot-headed revenge seekers don't. Information is power, and patience multiplies that power exponentially. So I started watching, I started learning. I discovered that their affair had been going on for 3 months. 3 months of lies, of Sarah kissing me goodbye in the morning, and Jake clapping me on the shoulder like we were best friends. 3 months of them laughing about how clueless I was, how easy it was to fool me in my own home. The betrayal cut deep, but the disrespect cut deeper. They were using my apartment, my furniture, my trust as the backdrop for their little romance. Jake would even borrow my cologne before their secret dates, coming back smelling like my own scent mixed with Sarah's perfume. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because while I was conducting my surveillance, I discovered something else about Jake, something that would become the key to my revenge. Jake was obsessed with getting into Harvard Law School. Not just interested, not just hopeful, obsessed. His entire identity was wrapped up in becoming a lawyer, specifically a Harvard-educated lawyer. He had newspaper clippings about famous Harvard Law alumni taped to his bedroom wall. He wore a Harvard sweatshirt so often I was surprised it hadn't disintegrated. His laptop screensaver was a photo of Harvard's campus, and he was actually qualified for it. Jake had a 3.9 GPA, excellent LSAT scores, and impressive extracurricular activities. His personal statement was brilliant. I know because I read it while he was out with my girlfriend. He wrote about growing up poor, about being the first in his family to attend college, about his burning desire to use law as a tool for social justice. It was actually moving. Under different circumstances, I might have been proud to know someone with such noble aspirations. But these weren't different circumstances. Jake had already submitted his early admission application when I made my discovery. The deadline had passed, his fate was sealed, and all he could do was wait for the response that would determine his entire future. That's when I realized something beautiful. Jake had put all his eggs in one basket, and I had access to that basket. My plan started small. I began with his computer, which he never bothered to password protect because, after all, who would want to mess with a trustworthy guy like Jake? I started by subtle changes to his email settings, ensuring that important messages would end up in spam folders or be delayed by hours. Then I moved to his academic life. Jake was a teaching assistant for Professor Williams' constitutional law class, a position that was crucial for his law school recommendations. I started arriving at Jake's office hours pretending to need help with coursework, but really I was there to plant seeds of doubt. I'd ask seemingly innocent questions about Jake's availability and reliability. I'd mention how I'd seen him coming home very late on nights when he was supposed to be grading papers. I'd express concern about whether he was handling his responsibilities properly, always framing it as worry for a friend. Professor Williams started paying closer attention to Jake's work. started noticing the little things that had always been there but had previously gone unobserved. The occasional late submission, the slightly rushed feedback on student papers, the distracted demeanor during faculty meetings. But the real masterstroke came in November, when Harvard requested additional materials from Jake, a supplemental essay and an updated transcript. This was actually a positive sign. It meant they were seriously considering his application. Jake was ecstatic. He spent weeks crafting the perfect supplemental essay, writing and rewriting it dozens of times. He would stay up until 3 in the morning, hunched over his laptop, polishing every sentence until it gleamed. And every night, after he finally went to bed, I would read his work. The essay was about integrity, specifically about how his moral compass had been shaped by growing up in a community where people looked out for each other, where trust was sacred, where your word was your bond. He wrote about the importance of honesty in the legal profession, about how lawyers have a responsibility to uphold the highest ethical standards. The irony was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. On the night before the supplemental materials were due, Jake finally finished his essay. He printed it out, read it one last time, and went to bed satisfied that he'd created something truly special. He had. It was genuinely excellent work, but excellent work is only as good as its delivery. See, Jake had a habit of leaving his laptop open when he went to sleep, usually with his email client running in the background. And that night, while he dreamed about walking across Harvard Yard in a cap and gown, I made a few small adjustments to his submission. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would be immediately obvious. I changed a few key dates in his timeline, introduced a small contradiction between his personal statement and his supplemental essay, and modified one of his professor references to make it seem slightly less enthusiastic. But the real coup de grace was even more subtle. I changed the formatting of his essay just enough to make it appear rushed and unprofessional. Different fonts, inconsistent spacing, misaligned paragraphs, the kind of details that suggest a candidate who doesn't pay attention to the little things. In the legal profession, details matter. Precision matters. And Harvard Law School knows this better than anyone. Jake submitted his materials on time, confident that he'd presented his best self to the admissions committee. He spent the next few months walking around with a spring in his step, already mentally preparing for life in Cambridge. Meanwhile, I was executing phase 2 of my plan. I started working on Jake's reputation within our shared social circle. Nothing obvious, nothing that could be traced back to me. Just little comments here and there, small seeds of doubt about Jake's character. I'd mentioned to mutual friends how Jake had been acting differently lately, more secretive, less trustworthy. I'd share concerns about money that had gone missing from our apartment, money that I'd actually hidden myself. I'd express worry that Jake might be dealing with some personal issues that were affecting his judgment. The beauty of this approach was that people started noticing things that had always been there, but had never seemed significant. Jake's late nights suddenly seemed suspicious. His secretive phone calls, which were actually with Sarah, began to look like something more sinister. By February, when Harvard rejection letters typically arrive, Jake's reputation had been systematically undermined in ways so subtle that no one, including Jake himself, could identify the source. The rejection letter arrived on a Thursday. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard Jake scream from his bedroom. Not a yell, not a shout, a scream of pure anguish, the sound of someone watching their entire future collapse in real time. He came stumbling out of his room, holding the letter with shaking hands, his face pale as paper. For a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered Sarah laughing in his bedroom, remembered 3 months of lies and betrayal, remembered how they'd used my own home as their playground. The sympathy evaporated. Jake spent the next week in a state of complete shock. He couldn't understand what had gone wrong. His grades were excellent, his test scores were perfect, his recommendations should have been stellar. He called the admissions office, demanding to know what had happened, but they simply told him that the applicant pool had been extremely competitive that year. What they didn't tell him, what they couldn't tell him, was that his application had raised small but significant red flags. The inconsistencies in his timeline, The contradiction between his essays, the unprofessional formatting, the lukewarm recommendation from Professor Williams, who had grown increasingly concerned about Jake's reliability. Individually, these issues might have been overlooked. Together, they painted a picture of a candidate who lacked attention to detail and possibly the integrity that Harvard law demanded. Jake's backup schools had similar concerns. The same subtle sabotage that had undermined his Harvard application affected his other submissions as well. By April, he had been rejected by every law school he'd applied to. His entire life plan had crumbled, and he had no idea why. The beautiful thing about perfect revenge is that the victim never sees it coming, and they never fully understand what hit them. Jake knew that something had gone wrong, but he couldn't identify what. He blamed bad luck, fierce competition, maybe even some kind of cosmic injustice. He never suspected that his roommate, his friend, the guy he'd been betraying for months, had systematically dismantled his future with the precision of a master surgeon. Meanwhile, my relationship with Sarah was reaching its natural conclusion. I'd stopped caring about her months ago, once I'd discovered her true nature. She was a symptom, not the disease. Jake was the disease, and I was focused on the cure. In May, I finally broke up with Sarah, citing our growing apart and different life goals. She was surprised but not devastated. After all, she had Jake to comfort her. They could finally be together openly, which they thought was what they'd wanted all along. But relationships built on deception rarely survive in the light of day. Without the thrill of secrecy, without the excitement of forbidden romance, Jake and Sarah discovered they didn't actually have much in common. Their relationship limped along through the summer and died quietly in September. Jake, meanwhile, was working at a local insurance office, filing paperwork and answering phones. It wasn't what he'd planned for his life, but his options were limited. The law school rejections had shattered his confidence, and he'd started to believe that maybe he wasn't cut out for the legal profession after all. He talked about trying again the following year, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. The Jake, who used to stay up until 3 a.m, perfecting his essays, was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned to settle for less. I graduated that spring and moved to another city for a job in finance. Jake and I parted ways amicably, even warmly. He thanked me for being such a good roommate, for putting up with his stress during the law school application process, for being a friend when he needed one most. I shook his hand and wished him luck with genuine sincerity. After all, I'd already gotten everything I wanted from him. 3 years passed before I saw Jake again. I was visiting my old college town on business when I stopped by a department store to pick up a few things. The young man behind the counter looked familiar, but it took me a moment to place him. His hair was thinner, his shoulders more stooped, his eyes lacking the fire that had once burned so brightly. It was Jake, working retail, wearing a name tag and asking if I'd found everything I needed. We talked for a few minutes. He told me about his life, how he'd never reapplied to law school, how he'd gotten married to a woman I didn't know, how they were expecting their first child. He seemed content, or at least resigned to his circumstances. He asked about my life, and I told him about my career, my apartment in the city, my plans for the future. I could see something flicker in his eyes. Not jealousy exactly, but a recognition of what might have been. As I was leaving, Jake called out to me one last time. He said he'd always wondered what went wrong with his law school applications, how someone with his qualifications could have been rejected across the board. He'd never figured it out, and it still bothered him sometimes. I looked him in the eye and told him that sometimes life just doesn't go according to plan, that maybe it had all worked out for the best, that he seemed happy with his new life. He nodded and smiled, but I could see the question still burning behind his eyes. I left the store and never saw him again. Some people might say that what I did was wrong, that the punishment didn't fit the crime, that I destroyed someone's life over a cheating girlfriend. But those people don't understand the nature of justice. Jake didn't just cheat with my girlfriend. He violated the most basic principles of trust and loyalty while living under my roof, eating my food, using my Wi-Fi to send love letters to the woman who was supposed to be mine. He betrayed me in the most intimate and personal way possible, then looked me in the eye every day and pretended to be my friend. That kind of betrayal deserves a response that matches its depth and calculation. I didn't destroy Jake's life in a fit of rage. I didn't let emotion cloud my judgment or make me sloppy. I studied him, learned his weaknesses, identified what mattered most to him, and then systematically dismantled it with the patience and precision of a master craftsman. Jake wanted to be a lawyer, someone who upholds justice and fights for what's right. But he'd proven that he had no understanding of justice, no respect for what's right, no integrity worth defending. So I taught him about justice. I showed him what happens when actions have consequences, when betrayal has a price, when someone finally holds you accountable for your choices. The beautiful thing about perfect revenge is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't gloat or explain or demand recognition. It simply exists, silent and complete, like a work of art that only the artist fully understands. Jake will never know that I was the architect of his downfall. He'll never understand that every rejection letter, every missed opportunity, every closed door was the result of a plan set in motion by someone he thought he could trust. And maybe that's the most perfect part of all. Sometimes justice is served in silence, and sometimes the most devastating victories are the ones no one ever knows you won. But I know, and for some kinds of betrayal that knowledge is revenge enough.